One of the most important things when building any website is performance. And images have, by far, the biggest impact on page loading. And so it's very important that images are optimized on any page. And for that, we can use a strategy called lazy loading images. So let me show you now how to implement that strategy in JavaScript. And the effect that I'm talking about is this one. So watch for what happens with the images in this section here. So you see, as we approach it, it basically starts to load. And then once it's finished, it will get displayed. And that placeholder, which is there in the beginning, gets replaced. So you see that? So let me quickly show you in the HTML how we implement that. Oh, and we're actually already here. So it's these features here. And so each of these features has an image. So the main ingredient to this lazy loading strategy is that we have a very low resolution image, which is really small and which is loaded right in the beginning. So that's this image here. And you see that the dimensions are only 200 times 120 in this case. So let's actually take a look at that image here. And so you see it's really small and it's only 16 kilobytes, while the real one, so this one called digital, is almost half a megabyte. So that's a huge, huge difference. And that image we then reference here in this data source attribute. So that's a special attribute that we can use, but any other would work as well. So this is not a standard HTML attribute, but instead it's one of these special data attributes that we can do ourselves. Okay? And so basically the idea is to, as we scroll to one of these low resolution images, we will then replace this low resolution image with the one that is here specified in the data source attribute. And we then also are going to remove this class here, which is kind of this filter which makes this image blurred. Because without this filter, let me show that to you. Without this, it would look really terrible. So too small to change this now here. Okay, but let's just remove it here for a second, just so you can see what it looks like. And so maybe you can see, or maybe it's too small, but notice that it's like really pixelated and really ugly. Okay, and so I created this filter basically, and so it makes it look like this. So it hides the fact that it is actually way too small for its size. All right, so let's put it back here. And so this is what this class looks like. It's simply a blur filter. And so modern CSS allows us to do this really cool effect. Okay, so let's implement this, and that's actually not too hard, using the intersection observer API one more time. So lazy loading images. And so once again, this one is really great for performance, while the other things we did so far are more visual things. This one really impacts how your site works, and especially for your users who might have a slow internet connection or a low data plan or a slow cell phone. And we always have to think about these users as well. Not everyone has a super high-end computer or the latest phone. All right? Anyway, let's start by selecting our images. So let's call them image targets. And this selector is going to be a little bit different this time, because we don't want to select all the images. So we could simply do a selector of image, and that would then give us all the images. But however, not all of them are going to be lazy loaded. For example, this one here, or we have some down here somewhere. Yeah, so these avatars here, or even this logo. So these are not lazy loaded. And so the ones that will be lazy loaded are the ones that have this attribute here. So this data source attribute, because that's where we specify the real high-resolution picture. And so we can actually select for elements which contain this property. So if you're familiar with CSS, maybe you know how to do that. But in case you're not, this is how it works. So we select all the images which have the property of data source. Okay, and that's it. So let's check that, just to be sure, so that it's going to work. And so indeed, here we have these 3 images. Okay, and nothing else. Then let's create our image observer. And so this is now always the same. Here our callback function, which I'm going to call load image in a second, and then our options. And now let's attach this image observer here basically to all these targets. Okay, so I'm going to loop one more time over our targets, just like we did with the section previously. And this time let's actually use an arrow function, because all we want to do is to use the image observer that we created previously to observe each image. Now let's create that callback function here also pretty fast. So it gets the entries and also the observer. Now, okay, as always, starting with the options here, and again the root set to the entire viewport. And let's start with the threshold at 0. And then we can adjust it as we go. But what matters really here is this callback function. So as always, this is where our functionality is. And so again, we have only one threshold, so only one entry. So I'm getting that here. And now let's check out actually this entry. Okay, so here we already got 3 of them, but all of them are not yet intersecting. Or actually it says that this one is. Well, but it isn't really, because it's down here. So that's a bit weird. Oh, but of course, this still comes from the sections. So this is still coming from up here somewhere. Okay, let's delete it here from the sections. And now let's see if it's working. And now it is indeed an image. Okay, now it appeared a little bit before, and that's because remember that our sections are actually a little bit shifted, right? Because of these hidden class that we added to them, they are shifted 8 rem down. So remember that from here. Let's see. Yeah. So because of this translate here, they are moved 8 rem down. And so then therefore this event will fire a little bit early, but that's not a problem at all. All right. What matters is that the event fired correctly and that it is indeed intersecting. Let's just clear it here to wait for the next ones. And so here you get the next one already. And so that is indeed this next lazy image here. And then the next one here as well. Oh, so this one. Okay. And then as we're moving out of them, then we get even more, because now they're no longer intersecting. And so once again, we need to only do something if they are actually intersecting. So we're going to use the same guard clause as before. So if they're not intersecting, is intersecting, then we want an early return. But otherwise, we now want to replace the source attribute with the data.source, right? So as we reach the image, it's finally time to replace the placeholder image, which is at the source, with the one we actually want, which is data source. So just like before, each of these images here is at target, or actually at entry dot target. So that's the element that's currently being intersected. And then dot source equals entry dot target dot dataset. Remember, that's where these special data properties are stored, and then dot source from there. Okay, so this is already the main functionality right here. So let's try that. But you will not really see it happening because there's still this blurry filter here on top. But if we inspect this now, we should already see that the source is now actually already the original image. So you see that it's the really big one, while the other ones are still the lazy ones. Well, at least this one. The second one is already also the original one because it's already in the viewport too. All right. So that's great. That's working just fine. Now all we need to do is to then remove that class that has this blurred filter. So that's the lazy image class. Now, how do we do that? Well, it's a little bit tricky because this replacing of the source attribute actually basically happens behind the scenes. So JavaScript finds the new image that it should load and display here, and it does that behind the scenes. And once it's finished loading that image, it will emit the load event. And the load event is just like any other event. And so we can just listen for it and then do something. So on that image, so that's entry.target, we can do add event listener and listen for the load event. Okay. And actually, let me show you why it is important that we do this. So let's say that we removed that lazy image class right away. So entry.target.classlist.remove lazy image. Let's scroll up here, reload. And then, well, in this case, the loading happens so fast that we don't even see a problem. Maybe we can change that here in the network tab. So this is a completely new tab, but what we can do here is to simulate or speed. So this is a bit too big here actually, I guess. So I'm not used to this size. Let me make it a little bit smaller. So let's change it here to fast or to slow 3G. And maybe then we can see what happens. So it's now faking that these images are loading really slow. So did you see them here blurred now? So it's really blurred. You see? But we already removed the filter. And so here you can see how the image is loading basically in the background. And so it's doing that really slow now because we said that we are on a slow network here. And now you see it's finished here, and now the original image is being displayed. So hopefully you could see that. I'm not sure if the resolution of the video is going to be good enough to see it, but I did for sure see it. And here actually now the same is happening. Let me increase the size of the window a bit maybe. So you see it's pretty blurred, but once it's going to be finished, you will then see the final and beautiful version showing up here. All right. So we're going to come back to this network tab later when we start loading data from remote sources on the internet. So this is a very important tab in the browser tools. But for now, it's also nice to see the images loading over time behind the scenes. Well, it's taking a lot of time. So let me just go back to the code here. And so, yeah, now it's finished actually. And so by the time this loading finishes, it will emit this load event. And so it is best to then only remove that blurry filter once that is done. All right. So it's loading again, very slow now. And you see that now it keeps being blurred, and it will only disappear once the image is in fact loaded. So I'm not going to wait for that because it seems like it's going to take forever. Oh, actually it's already done here. And so you see now the image is done loading, and at the same time the filter appeared, or actually disappeared. Let's set it back to online. And so now all of it happens basically at the same time, because we are working on our local development machine. And so there, of course, the image basically arrives instantaneously. Now, as a last step, we can just, as we did before, stop observing these images because it's no longer necessary. We already did our task of loading, and so we no longer need this. So entry.target, and that's it. So I hope that with this video, I could convince you that it's really important to implement this kind of functionality into your own sites. So all you really need to do is to generate these placeholder images and blur them a little bit, and then implement this kind of logic, which really shouldn't be too much work, right? Let me just get rid of this console.log here. Let's load it again, because actually we want probably to load the images a little bit before we actually reach them. So ideally, we don't want our users to notice that we are lazy loading these images, right? So all of this should basically happen in the background without our user noticing that. And so we should probably make these images load a little bit earlier. So to do that, we can again specify a negative root margin here. So root margin of, let's say, minus 200 pixels. All right. And so this is just the same as we did previously here with the navigation. So to make the navigation load a little bit before the threshold was actually reached. And here we are doing the same. So exactly 200 pixels before any of the images is loaded, it should already start loading. And by doing that, we don't see any delay in loading when we browse the page. Well, actually, that didn't quite work. Maybe it should be plus 200. So as you see, this is all a matter of trying out and figuring out as we go here. And so now, indeed, as we approach the images, they're already fully loaded. So now that happens 200 pixels before we reach them. All right. And with that, our functionality here is complete. And we are now indeed almost finished with this project. All that's left to implement is really this slider. So this component here. And so that is what we're going to do in the next video.